Most people think donkeys get better in a straight line, but that's not what we're seeing with Tony. Because when he actually understands what I'm asking and he starts trying, that's usually when things begin to fall apart. He doesn't panic. He doesn't shut down. He just starts backing up like the work doesn't make sense anymore. And for a long time, I thought that meant resistance or even just naughty behavior. But the more I worked with him, the less that explanation actually fit, because Tony wasn't refusing to engage. He was engaging, and then losing clarity right when things started to matter. And that's what started to change how I was looking at everything. One of the first things we worked on was something simple, just asking him to accept touch down his legs. And right away, you can see a pattern start to show up. He'll allow a little bit, then he shifts away. Not explosive, not dramatic, just stepping out of the moment. And what made this really interesting is he doesn't stay gone. He backs out for a second and then he comes right back in like nothing's happened. That changed what I thought I was seeing, because that's not a donkey refusing the work. That's a donkey losing clarity for a moment and then re-entering the conversation. And that distinction matters, because if I misread that moment, I'll train the wrong thing. What I started noticing when I slowed this down is that it wasn't random timing either. It would usually happen right after I started asking for a little more commitment, not more pressure, just a little more commitment from him. And instead of pushing through that moment, he would step out, reset himself, and then come right back like he was ready to try again. And that part is the part I didn't want to miss, because if I only focused on the moment he backed up, I would assume he was done. But if I watched the full pattern, he was actually still participating, just in a very different way than I expected. At one point, I made a change in the session. I actually removed the oats for a while because I wanted to see if it would help him stay more focused on the work itself. And what I noticed when I did that was he didn't suddenly become more engaged with me. Instead, he started looking for another place where the right answer might be clearer. So you can actually see him shift his attention toward Dan, not because he was ignoring the work, but because he was still trying to find something that made sense to him. And this is where it gets interesting, because from my perspective, I had removed the motivator to improve clarity, but from his perspective, I may have actually removed part of the clarity itself. So instead of him becoming more focused, he started searching for the most predictable outcome in the environment. And that told me something I didn't fully appreciate at the time. It wasn't that he wasn't willing to engage. It was when one pathway becomes less clear, he will immediately look for another one that feels more consistent. And in that moment, Dan wasn't a distraction. He was the next clearest option in his environment. One of the things Tony understood really well was leading by the foot. He didn't seem bothered by the rope touching his legs. He was happy to pick up his foot when I asked, and he was even comfortable with me directing where he placed his foot back onto the ground. At that point, I felt like we were making really good progress. And that's where I made the decision that I think a lot of us make when training. Because things were going so well, I decided to ask for just a little bit more. First, I asked if I could simply hold his foot up for an extra second. He handled that really well. So then I asked for one more thing. While I was holding his foot up with a rope, I started reaching down to touch his leg. That's where everything changed. Up until then, if Tony became uncertain, he would usually back up a step or two, regroup, and come right back into the conversation. But this time was different. Instead of quietly resetting, he started backing up with more determination. That told me I had crossed a line. Not because he was being difficult, but because I had asked for more than he was ready to process at one time. Looking back, I don't think the problem was asking him to hold up his foot. And I don't think the problem was touching his leg. The problem was combining two new ideas before one of them had become completely comfortable. That moment changed how I approached the rest of his training. Instead of thinking, what is the next step? I started asking, which part of this is no longer clear to Tony? That one question has probably taught me more than anything else during his training. Up to this point, I had mostly noticed Tony backing up when we were working at Liberty. But it wasn't until we started tying him to work on his feet in the barn, I began to notice something much more consistent. He would start each session really well. He would understand what I was asking. He would make progress. Sometimes he would even surprise me with how quickly he picked up something. And then, almost without warning, we'd start going backwards. Sometimes that meant he would back up. Other times it looked different. He simply couldn't accept something that he had been comfortable with just a few minutes earlier. At first, I thought we were losing progress, but after seeing it happen over and over again, I stopped asking myself what changed. Instead, I started asking, when does it change? That's when I noticed a pattern. For Tony, after about 6 minutes of focused work, his learning seemed to level off. Not because he was unwilling, but because he seemed mentally full. So instead of trying to push through that point, I started giving him about a 5-minute break. When we came back, more often than not, he picked right back up where he had left off. Sometimes he was even better than before the break. At that time, I couldn't figure out why his processing window seemed so short. In my mind, Tony was about 4 years old. Then one day, I went back and looked at his paperwork I had remembered wrong. Tony was born in 2023. Because he was wild born, we don't know his exact birth month, but that means he's only turning 3 this year. Suddenly, a lot of things started making more sense. Young donkeys often have less mental stamina than mature donkeys, so the length of a training session needs to be adjusted to what's realistic for their age and stage of development. This doesn't mean they can't learn. It simply means they need shorter sessions and more frequent breaks.
No more. You have to take a break.
After watching this enough times, I started to notice something I had missed before. It wasn't just what I was asking, it was how long I was asking it for. With Tony, there seemed to be a point in the session where things would shift, not suddenly, but consistently. After a few minutes of focused work, his progress didn't just slow down, it started to fall apart. So instead of trying to push through that point, we started doing something different. We gave him a short break to reset. And what surprised me was this. When we came back after his break, he wasn't worse. He wasn't where we left him off. He was often better. Not because he forgot what we were doing, but because he had processed it. And that's where this started to become bigger than just Tony, because I started seeing the same patterns show up in other donkeys too. So I started looking for what was consistent underneath all of it. And what I began to realize was there are certain conditions that have to be present for learning to stay open. Now, you guys have heard me talk about 3 C's, which later on turned into 4 C's. I used to try to get curiosity, and then connection, and then cooperation. And then I realized we needed clarity. So we went from the 3 C's to curiosity, connection, clarity, and cooperation. But this has grown again into 5 C's. The 5 C's are comfort, clarity, curiosity, which develop connection and cooperation. Now, these are not steps to follow. They're conditions that have to exist for learning to continue. And what I've learned is different donkeys lose different ones at different times. And when one drops out, the whole conversation changes. And what surprised me the most is that Tony doesn't respond to all five the same way. He doesn't break down in the same place every time, but there's always one missing piece. And when that piece drops out, that's when you see the backing up. That's when you see the confusion. That's when you see the disengagement. And the interesting part is, it doesn't look like resistance from the outside. It looks like a donkey trying to stay in the conversation, but losing the thread of what the conversation is about.
Okay. No
And
more.
that changed
You have to take a
how I
break.
think about almost everything we do. Because now I'm not just looking at behavior, I'm looking at which condition disappeared. And this is what I've started applying with every new donkey we bring in. First touch, first lead, first moments of confusion, because they all show it differently, but they all show it. Some lose comfort, some lose clarity, some lose curiosity the moment pressure shows up. And Tony is still teaching me this every time. I think I figured him out. Because the moment you label a donkey as naughty, you usually miss the part where they're actually trying to understand.